So I thought I'd start by telling you a story. It's the story of an interaction I had very recently in which I was speaking to a colleague, and he was telling me about this, I think it was like a conference that he went to, and they're in the automotive industry. So he goes to this conference and there's a German man there, and one of the topics at this conference or this get together, I can't really remember exactly what it was, but one of the things that came up was China's position or entry into the luxury car market. And so he's telling me the story, and he says, I don't know if he brought this up, but that was the topic of conversation, as in, I don't know if he brought this up with the German gentleman. And that was the topic of conversation. And he says, this German man says, no, China cannot be a luxury brand maker. There are only 5 countries in the world that make luxury branding. So he then, in our interaction, this colleague proceeds to ask me what they are. And immediately I know one thing, that they're going to be European countries. So I'm guessing, and I think one of them was UK, the other one was Germany, but it was South Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and there was one other, I can't remember, I don't even care. And then I said, okay. So he then says, yeah, and this German man explains to him that because to have luxury, it's not about the quality, it's about the history and the heritage. And so I'm like, okay. And he says, and when I think about it, he's right. He's right. And I was like, okay. At that point, we were both at that time waiting to go into separate meetings, and his meeting called him in. He had to present, and his meeting called him in. And I was just like, the psychosis is real. The psychosis is real. Are we to really think that it's only among European countries that we could find luxury because they're the only countries that have story and heritage? I guffawed and I just said, you know what, I'm going to get on with my life. I don't have time for this. But it was a story that came to mind when I was thinking about today's episode. And, it's a story that we hear. If you've grown up in Europe, if you've grown up in the UK, I can speak from the UK perspective because that's where I was born. We have this idea that Europe is this beacon of prosperity. We've got social welfare, we've got stable, Europe is stable. We're a stable place, this stable growth, high wages, and we've got this safety net that apparently the whole world admires, and it isn't just this. When people talk about European supremacy, it isn't just about this thing that happened in the past. It's a German man at a conference feeling that he was quite entitled and very much in the right to state emphatically that the only countries that could produce luxury brands were European countries, which, anyway, we're not going to get into that today. That's not, funny enough, the topic of today's episode, but I thought I'd bring that up because I found it very interesting. And this grandiose sense of self that is shared by many people, to be honest, is something that I find interesting as it lies juxtaposed to headlines, for example, that can tell a different story. So we have headlines such as Germany slipping into recession, Italy's debt is at record highs, Eurozone growth is flatlining, all of these things which suggest that, we're not necessarily, and I'm saying we as in a conciliatory we, not as in I really feel I belong to this group, but sometimes people should take a look in the mirror and think about if this idea and this grandeur that we think we're promoting exist in reality or just within our heads or in the story that we've told ourselves. Welcome back to the Misinformation Podcast, the show where I try to help you make sense of the forces that are shaping your money, your world, your future. Let us look a little bit behind the headlines to see what's really going on. My name is Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant, and today I'm taking shots at Europe. No, I'm not actually taking shots, but I'm going to look a little bit at what's going on in Europe and where we are and how this might or might not affect you. But stay tuned and we'll get into it. So today, as I said, I'm not taking shots at Europe. I just want to look at, what's going on in Europe? What's going on in the EU? Why is the EU stalling? What does that mean for the UK? And especially in a post-Brexit UK? Because I think there's an idea. We had this very binary idea of the EU and Europe. Certainly, if you say to some people that we are in Europe as a continent, they will argue with you. Didn't quite grasp the difference between EU and Europe, but I digress. We need to look at what's going on in the EU because we do not exist in a vacuum, as I've said before. And whilst we may not be in the club and we can complain from outside the club, even though we can't get in, people can still come out the club and throw bottles at us. And actually, if the club burns down, we're probably going to get burnt too. So what's going on? What's going on with the French, whether there's unrest in France, whether we're looking at Southern Europe's youth unemployment rates or Germany's stalled industrial engine. Something is broken. Something's not working quite right. And as I've said before, despite leaving the EU, the UK remains firmly entangled in the fate of the EU and the fate of Europe. So today I want to unpack a little bit about why Europe isn't growing and why Britain should care a lot more than it does. Okay, so according to the IMF's April 2025 World Economic Outlook, the Eurozone's expected growth for this year was just 0.8%. Germany, which is Europe's largest economy, spent most of 2024 in a technical recession. And France and Italy are showing signs of what is called an anemic growth. So they need some iron. And to cap that all off, youth unemployment in Spain remains just above 20%, which is really a lot. So even Poland and Hungary, which in the 2010s, they saw like double-digit growth, their growth is also slowing. So that's partly due to energy prices, and in some cases, it's a freeze on EU funds due to rule of law concerns. And to be clear, I'm not trying to catastrophize. Europe is not necessarily about to collapse, but it is definitely in a low growth rut. So what's behind this slowdown? Well, I'm going to break it down into like 4 major drivers for you. I know people like to speak in 3s, but I'm going to do 4. You're going to hang tight and you're going to get with it. Okay, so the first one is like aging population. Europe is one of the oldest continents demographically. The median age across the EU is now over 44. And in Germany, for example, the workforce is shrinking, which means fewer people are working, which means there are more pensions to fund because people aren't working and there are a lot of old people, and there's lower productivity and innovation. The second one is war. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. So no, the war in Ukraine disrupted Russia's gas exports, especially Germany and Eastern Europe. So you had countries like Germany and Italy, which were scrambling to replace the energy with expensive, like liquefied natural gases, the LNG stuff. You've also had austerity and fiscal cuts. Listen, Europe is still haunted by the debt crisis. There were policies that were put in place as a result of the financial crisis that are still in force today. And so many EU countries, for example, have tight limits on how much they can borrow due to EU rules that compare, for example, to the US, where you can just do whatever you want because it's the US. They don't care. They don't learn. It's fine. They're like out there. They'll be like, yeah, it happened once. It'll probably happen again. But as long as people get rich, we're going to be fine with that. So we do have this real rut to get over. You also look at the post-COVID response. The US was very prepared to take on a lot of debt, and they did so. You can see that, in their constant debt crisis that they have, but they took on a lot of debt so that they can inject like trillions into the economy post-COVID. The EU's fiscal support was quite small, patchier, and so the result has been that there's been a slower recovery. And the final driver, I would say, would be weak productivity. So Europe lags behind the US in tech, for example, tech adoption, digital innovation, and even corporate R&D. We also have a level of regulatory complexity that they don't necessarily have, and we've got fragmented markets. So that can always just slow everything down a lot more. Now, some of you may be sitting there thinking, well, we left the EU. So if they're not growing, sounds like a them problem. It isn't. It's our problem too. Listen, this wasn't the clean divorce that everyone thought it was going to be, nor could it be. We just don't live in that type of world. Despite all the dreams that have been sold to you by that man with a surname that rhymes with garage, it's just not true. So we have politically, yes, we have separated from the EU, but economically, we are still married. We still go together. The EU is our largest trading partner. Let's start there. And that makes sense. Look where they are, look where we are. Why wouldn't they be? Around 42% of exports from the UK go to the EU. Nearly half of our imports come from them. So we made these big decisions because we decided we were going to go out on our own. And the reality is, it was never going to be like that. So what does that mean? Well, it means when those countries slow down, they buy less from the UK. They invest less in the UK. They send fewer tourists, business visitors, and students. And also, Brexit created new barriers. Yeah? Because that's what you wanted. So we got them. But in times like this, it's just a ball ache. Because not only are these economies weaker, these EU economies are weaker, we're less able to access them competitively. So we're out here with our long johns in our hands. So let's talk about the real world consequences for the UK. Number one is obviously going to be trade. If there's sluggish EU growth, that means that the UK exporters, especially in like manufacturing, chemicals, automotive and agriculture, they're going to see less demand for their products. Financial services is another one. Like London may have kind of avoided a mass exodus post-Brexit, but EU demand for UK services is not growing. There's less investment, fewer cross-border M&A deals, and there's slower deal flow. And the third thing is our shared supply chains. Listen, again, despite this idea that many people had that there will just be a clean break and we would go out alone, that's not what happens. Most UK manufacturers operate in pan-European supply chains. So if parts aren't moving, say a factory shuts down in like Italy or in France, the UK plant will stall too. This also affects labour mobility, investment confidence, and currency volatility. And let's not forget, if European stagnation becomes politically volatile or leads to political instability, the UK may have to then deal with protectionist governments who don't want to, trade or do a lot of things with other countries and do a lot to support their own industry, which is detrimental to the UK. Economic migrants coming over, because if other economies aren't doing well, then people will naturally leave and search for work where they can get it. And also just security spillovers. So what's the fix? How do we fix this? Well, I'm not going to fix anything. I've just come here to tell you about it. But there are things that can be done. The EU does have tools. They've got like a huge internal market. That's why it's an EU. That was the whole point of the club in the first place, is to have all of these resources and have access to them. We've got skilled labour. No one's saying just because there aren't jobs available in certain regions, we do have a skilled labour force. There's also the opportunity that comes from the green and digital transition plans. So all is not lost. But to recover, Europe will need to invest. That's just the long and short of it. They will need to. They probably need to look at their fiscal rules as well. So some reformation of some fiscal rules is going to be necessary. And they need to try and unlock capital for innovation and growth. Those are the things that you need. Innovation and growth in these regions. As for the UK, we need to stop pretending that we're immune. None of this hurts us. It's nothing to do with us. It is, it does, it can. In fact, there's a case for closer economic coordination with the European Union, more like regulatory alignments that will speed things up, especially in key sectors. If we have difference in regulation and we're trading with someone, if you have different rules, it holds things up, it's inefficient, it costs money. Guys, get on board, understand, know what the program is. And also there's an opportunity for joint investment in certain sectors, such as like clean energy infrastructure or supply chain security. All of these things are mutually beneficial, and I need us to start thinking outside of the box and stop following sound bites about what about our country, or we have to look after our own first. Sometimes looking after your neighbour helps you too. So what's the takeaway? Well, a stagnant Europe makes for a weaker West and a more vulnerable Britain. So if they are weak, we are weak. That is just the long and short of it. Despite what the dreams that are being sold to you, packaged as patriotism or sovereignty, the UK's future will never be entirely separate from the continent that we sit on. That's just ridiculous. It's not going to happen. And it's not that I'm trying to say that people are stupid. Unless they are, then, whatever. But I just think that we need to think about the fact that that's very unrealistic. That's not going to happen. Economic decoupling is just a fantasy. We trade with them. We share energy grids with them. We share investment flows. We go together. We've just made it more difficult for ourselves, but that doesn't change the nature of the world in which we operate. And I want you to know that the people that are arguing against this know that. They know that. But if there is expense and if there's costs that can rise, what they want to do is position themselves squarely so they will be the beneficiaries of those increased costs. That's all it is. It's not because they think it's going to be better for you. They absolutely don't, and they don't give a shit. So ultimately, the question isn't, is the EU failing without us? The question is, are we smart enough to act as neighbours in the storm? Well, ladies, gentlemen, boys, girls, he, she, they, thems, that's all I've got time for today. Thank you for joining me again. I will be back next week for another episode. If you want to catch me in the meantime, in between time, I'm on social media. I'm on TikTok and Instagram at The Reluctant Accountant. If you are listening to this as an audio and you'd like to see some visuals, I have a YouTube channel. The video will go out, The Reluctant Accountant. But in the meantime, please stay tuned, lock in, subscribe, comment, tell me what you think, and I'll be back next week. See you then.